So thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'll follow up real quickly on a couple of other items that were just discussed. When we're talking about level 1 assessments and level 1 data, that's the map, it's also the classification, and it's the types of questions you can answer with that type of information. Sarah mentioned Playa and Lake modules. Those are not yet fully developed. They're on the list of things to do. So if you go looking for a Playa module, it's not there yet. But the other modules that we discussed are indeed available for use now. Projects might include mitigation, restoration sites, of course, but they would also include development projects, places where people are altering streams and wetlands for building things, building roads, building houses, building whatever. So there's some clarifications on some of the previous topics we've been discussing here today. So today, I'm Cliff Harvey. I work with the State Water Resources Control Board with the 401 unit. Among my duties there is working with the California Wetland Monitoring Work Group, where just because my boss told me to be there, I guess, I am serving as the chairman of the Level 2 Assessments Committee, have done that for a few years now. Get to work with folks like Sarah and Cara and some real interesting people that do some good work. Sarah provided an overview of CRAM. She mentioned that we want to emphasize that CRAM is part of the USEPA's 1, 2, 3 framework. Level 1 assessments, Level 2 assessments like CRAM, and Level 3 like measures of specific biological, chemical, or physical parameters. Cara presented a few case studies of how validation of new CRAM modules can be conducted and how validation work can provide useful insights. But how do we apply that in the regulatory context? How do we apply this to regulatory compliance? The 1, 2, 3 framework provides data that applies to single sites, but then it can be aggregated to monitor condition at the watershed scale. By applying a watershed approach. This is one way of applying a watershed approach. And we think that as more agencies and programs contribute data, the utility of the data increases for all those different users, whether they're doing restoration work, whether they're permitting development projects, whether they're just doing ambient assessments. But when we get into the regulatory world, we're talking about real time and money. People are building things, they need permits. And so if we are going to insist that we measure the effects of the things that people are doing, we need to have reliable means of measuring those things and reliable ways of assessing what the environmental damage and environmental mitigation needs might be. The first step in that is limit the practice of our methods to appropriate uses. As with any assessment method, CRAM doesn't do everything. It's important to limit use of CRAM to the things for which it was designed. Best way to do that is follow the basic instructions. The CRAM technical bulletin is out there. It's available for use. We encourage anyone who's looking at using CRAM for permitting and regulatory decisions to consult this guidance document. Notice it's about 2009 when that was published. We are working anxiously and as fast as we can on an update for this technical manual. We hope it will be available next year. People who have an interest in regulatory applications of these monitoring methods, please, if you have ideas or suggestions of things that would be helpful for us to address in this manual, please let us know. And then as you're following the guidance from the tech manual, you'll also be following the QA/QC procedures. That includes standardized training, like Sarah and Cara mentioned, standardized data collection methods, standardized data entry. We can't emphasize too much that the whole purpose of supporting regulatory decisions with these assessment methods depends on consistent application of the method. You can't be modifying the method. You can't be using it in ways that are inappropriate, at least not if you want that information to be used to support regulatory decisions. And so how are the regulatory agencies responding? It's varied. Every agency has its own priorities and its own purposes, and so adoption of the methods that the California Wetland Monitoring Work Group has developed has been varied across agencies. But right now, the Corps of Engineers, for example, the people you need to go to for a 404 permit under the Clean Water Act, they're supporting use of CRAM, not requiring it in every case, but especially in places where compensatory mitigation is needed, they're looking at using CRAM as part of the assessment of mitigation sites. One key statement in their current South Pacific guidance is that compensatory mitigation requirements determined through the Watershed Approach should not focus exclusively on specific functions. That means that level 3 data is great, but if you only look at specific single biological, physical, or chemical parameters without some framework that ties them together, you're going to be missing some things that are important for the 404 regulatory process. And this is also something that's very much supported by the USEPA, who's standing side by side with the Corps of Engineers on this. State and regional water boards have also begun using CRAM as part of permitting decisions in some cases. Rate and extent of adoption is uneven across regions, but it is growing. More and more regional boards are starting to figure out how to use this 1, 2, 3 framework and CRAM in their local regulatory programs. Regional boards are taking a more active role in interagency review teams for mitigation banks and in lieu fee programs, which in turn are looking to CRAM as a possible input to crediting strategies. There's a lot built into that statement, but what it means is that as the mitigation banks start using CRAM and the regional boards through the IRTs are working with the mitigation banks, we think that the use of these methods that we're discussing will start evolving and emerging into something that people will find useful and helpful in the long term when we're talking about long-term management and monitoring of mitigation sites, mitigation banks, HMMPs, SAMPs, HCPs, all these different planning frameworks that create mitigation banks and mitigation areas that offset development projects. The state wetland permitting procedures is still moving along, and as far as we know now, it will require use of conditional assessments when compensatory mitigation is involved at least. And so we're expecting that some support for CRAM, or what may come along in future years, a level 2 assessment strategy will be supported by the new procedures. We noticed that Region 6, the Lahontan Regional Water Board, has implemented a requirement to use EcoAtlas and CRAM in their 401 permitting program. It's a staged, stepwise process to introduce these methods into their regulatory programs, but it is happening now. And we expect other regional boards are going to gradually follow suit by implementing guidance that is suitable for those regions. And like I said a minute ago too, the one good example of the mitigation bank approach, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's in lieu fee program for the Central Valley does require that CRAM be used as part of the assessment of potential projects that would be adopted by the in lieu fee program that they would then in turn sell out for credits to developers. So the method is being used, but it's not consistent across all programs. The programs that are adopting it, though, we think are going to be influential and will drive a lot more attention and a lot more refinement of how we use these methods as these programs grow and develop. Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, mostly emphasize level 3 data. I think that's probably as much because of their own regulatory mandates as anything else. We haven't seen those guys adopt CRAM very much in their regulatory work. Other state agencies typically don't really have a consistent pattern. There's no consistent wetland and stream monitoring approach from one agency to the next within California. Strategies required by the Corps and the water boards and the Department of Fish and Wildlife tend to therefore be the default. But we notice that some regulated agencies, especially Caltrans, are leading in CRAM-related research and are seeing the value of integrating a 1, 2, 3 framework into their project planning. We noticed that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has conducted CRAM as part of the perennial stream assessment for many years. There's this huge treasure trove of data from the PSA program that is waiting to be used and could be used in other regulatory programs, or maybe even the LSA, the Lake and Stream Bed Alteration Program. So the opportunities are out there. Is Glenn Sibold here? Where's Glenn? Glenn's been doing a lot of the CRAM work. He's one of our CRAM trainers and leading the field teams for the Perennial Stream Assessment Program, and wanted to give a shout out to Glenn because he's been a very important co-worker with the development of CRAM. So, I want to point out one last thing. Sarah is working on a stressor index. Right now we have a stress checklist, but it's not an index, not a measurement. We are working on a stress index that we hope sometime over the next couple of years can be used to supplement or work with the basic CRAM scores. We think that that will add a lot more reliability and a lot more diagnostic capability to our level 2 assessments. And so the conclusion is, with CRAM right now, there's not really anybody in charge. And no one agency is showing comprehensive leadership. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe it's a good thing, because that means we have room for innovation and leadership and time to study how the methods are working. No one agency has just jumped in and says, you got to do it this way every time. That's probably a good thing. Agencies, NGOs, and private sector scientists can and are developing and adapting uses of CRAM to suit those agencies' purposes and to suit new needs for information. And this is a great thing, we believe, as long as CRAM developmental process is followed and as long as you keep the monitoring work group involved. We'd like to remind everyone that the monitoring work group has been working with the USEPA, the Corps of Engineers, the water boards for many years to develop these tools and keep them within sideboards, make them consistent for use statewide. And we want everybody to work with us to maintain that level of consistency so that we all have a good, reliable data set that can be applied statewide. For more information, go there, give us a call Cara, Sarah, myself. We'd be happy to work with you. And thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
How will the changes that...
We wait for Mike.
Wait for Mike. Yep.
Sure. How are the changes in WOTUS, Waters of the United States rule, impact the use of CRAM?
I I do not think any changes in jurisdictional status would affect the methodology. The methodology is independent of jurisdictional considerations. If there's a wetland in a place, we can measure its condition with CRAM, regardless of whether Uncle Sam claims it as a water of the United States.
I wanted to ask another question. Definitive stressors are often outside the assessment area. How will you set up your stressor index to include those stressors?
The stressor index that we are working with now is in beta testing. It looks at proximity, intensity, and duration of a range of different classes of stressors that are similar to the ones in the existing stressor checklist. I won't go into that in great detail other than to say we do stick our head up and look outside the wetland into the surrounding landscape. We do that with CRAM right now by looking at landscape stressors, percent development in the watershed, that sort of thing. The stressor index similarly looks up and looks around and takes what's going on in the landscape around your assessment area. Yeah. Others?
I have a question. How does the regulatory group look at citizen science and participating with collecting data? And I ask this because I'm trying to develop a citizen science program with the Sierra Club. I'm actually a scientist with Stanford, but I also take outings, national outings into the Sierra Mountains and also to Point Reyes. And I'd like to start incorporating my interest in science into these backpacking trips. So in terms, and I took Jim's course this year, in terms of us collecting data, how useful do you see that in terms of assisting with long-term monitoring and the regulations?
Well, just speaking as a lowly regulatory staff person who has to crank out permits, I use any good data that's available to me. I would be derelict in my duty if I did not use all available valid data sources. Anyone who wants to collect scientific environmental data that may be helpful in understanding the effects of human actions and that may be able to support regulatory decisions, I don't care if you're an NGO, a consultant, a business, another agency. If you've collected data in standardized methods in a valid sampling procedure using swamp, perhaps, protocols, that data can be used and it doesn't matter where it came from. So, there. Yeah, your data is as good as anybody else's if it was collected properly.